Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and of course, I'm joined today by my co-host, Robert Brant. Last week, nearly 200 investors, lenders, and project principals gathered at the London Stock Exchange for the third annual Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit. One of Canada's Maple 8 put it simply, at most conferences, the hallways are full. Here, nobody left the sessions. We can't think of anything that better summarizes what went on at this year's summit than that. In this episode, Rob and I discussed some of the highlights about what came out of the summit, identifying some of the conversations and the intelligence that matters for institutional capital watching Canada right now. What it means when an Indigenous nation lobbies government to advance a major LNG project, not block it, and what that tells European investors tracking Canadian energy supply. What the presence of some of the world's largest institutional asset managers revealed about where long-duration infrastructure capital is moving. We also touch on how the Canada-UK Defence and Resilience Partnership, which was announced just days before the summit, affected the conversations on Canada's circumpolar frontier, and what 4 decades of growing Indigenous enterprises at scale demonstrates to institutional leaders about the governance models behind these partnerships. The signals from the summit matter. Let's dive in. Good morning, Rob. Here we are on Monday. Great to see you again today.
You too, Mark. Good morning. I'm still in London.
Yes, I can tell that's not your usual oak-paneled office. Anyway, so we had the summit last week. We had day 1 and day 2 was some closed conversations, which are also very interesting. And then for some of the lucky ones who are here, we got to go to a football match yesterday and watch Chelsea and Man City play a game, which those who are over from Canada all seem to be Chelsea supporters. And that was really entertaining in the sense we're at the end where they're scoring most of the goals. Unfortunately, Chelsea did not win. So it was disappointing from that point of view, but it was almost like a hockey game.
Yeah, so let's quickly move on from that result, Mark.
Nice
Better days ahead.
Yes, absolutely. All those teams in blue and white.
The sun was shining all week long on our summit, and of course we started with the Freedom of the City ceremony with Chief Tammy Cook-Searson and Tabitha Bull receiving the freedom, and they had their families, some of their families with them. That was a really nice way to start the week.
It is. It's always very special when we're able to ensure that some of the chiefs who come over are leaders like Tabitha receive the freedom of the city, because I think it comes back to the ties that bind Canada, the UK, and especially the Indigenous people. Now, the Indigenous people always talk about the relationship with the Crown, but we are now building a strong relationship for them with the city. And you may recall that somebody said in the city, he's not known as William the Conqueror. He's known as William the First because he didn't take over the city. He did a deal. So maybe we're just catching up to things with this focus on deals. But the UK has been prosperous for a long time, ever since. Anyway, let's come to the summit, Rob. So we said before the summit, of course, every year we need to deliver for all who are attending, whether they're sponsors, speakers, or delegates in the audience. And we thought this one would be the most consequential one yet. And we had nearly 200 people inside the room. So the feedback I've received, and I think we've got, has been really positive on this year's summit. What's the feedback you've had? What's your perception of looking back now?
Yeah, the feedback was immediate, wasn't it? I mean, on the day of the summit, I've never had so many conversations about what people want to do next year, the 4th annual. And so the ideas and suggestions and commitments to be back next year, and this is the way we want to do it. I can say I have not had that many conversations so early People really excited and generating some good suggestions for next year. But we should talk about this year because it was, you could see the evolution where we've come from over the 3 years, and how there's more money in the room. There are more leaders in the room. And as you said, we had 200, which is about max. Trying to keep it intimate. They don't want it to get big and not have the quality.
Quality's always been key since we started, Rob. You and I discussed at the beginning, it's about getting the right people from both sides of the pond in the room. And obviously we want to maintain that. And you just briefly mentioned, we will be back in the Square Mile next April in 2027. So it's good there's enthusiasm for it, continued enthusiasm and support. But let's come back to, some of the conversations. And again, the context of what's going on every day, it just reinforces the attractiveness of Canada as a destination for capital. And that's driven by a couple of things. World affairs, and we don't have to go through that every time because it's just the world we all live in now. But Canada is also much more focused on pivoting away from its southern neighbor to strengthen economic ties across the world. And, it's been a rupture, as our Prime Minister has said. And it just seems an opportune time. And when we had the delegates and the speakers in the room, it was really exciting in terms of some of those conversations, because this is a real opportunity. And I think the other feedback I got on the summit, one of the comments is, actually, you come to this summit and you have a real conversations. These are in-depth engagements and talking with people about things that are going to make a difference. And a lot of times the conversations just begin, but everybody says they have great conversations. It's not a networking event. It's a place to have some in-depth conversations, Rob.
Yeah, and in some cases, those are Canadians talking to Canadians, and more than one. In more than one case, I heard one CEO say to another CEO, both Canadians, "Gee, we've been trying for 6 months to get together, and it's taken a place like London to get us all in the same room." But the quality of the panels and the speakers, it is C-suite pretty much exclusively. And we have, I think, created a space for senior leaders to get together, and sometimes it's on and during sessions, sometimes it's over tea or something stronger later in the day. There are lots of small meetings going on outside of the summit.
Yes, and comes back to the convening power of the Square Mile. But I think coming back to even though we had the summit on the hottest day so far this year, and it was absolutely beautiful, unfortunately, I was in the theater. You were in the forum, so I didn't get to enjoy as much of the sun. But I think one noticeable point is, if you did take a washroom break or had to leave one of the two rooms, the corridors were empty because everybody was in the sessions. And as you've mentioned, a lot of times you go to these different conferences and, everybody's hanging out in the corridor having chats, but the people we had on stage, the conversations taking place were so engaging, nobody really wanted to miss it.
Yeah, Robert Sturgeon from Ontario Teachers Pension Plan made that comment to me. He said, most conferences, all kinds of people mingling during sessions in the hallways. He said, here, there's nobody in the hallways because the sessions are so good, you don't want to miss them.
What a great compliment from one of the Maple 8. And again, the different players in Canada meeting here in London to push those conversations. So it's not only a chance for the Indigenous people to meet individuals and companies over here, but as you said earlier, it's for Canadians as well to engage with people they don't necessarily have the time to engage back in Canada when you don't have everything going in and around the office with you, that you can set aside some time. And as you mentioned, there's been follow-up meetings and meetings around the summit to drive those conversations. So that is very very positive. And it was interesting because the Canada-UK Defence and Resilience Partnership was announced in the days before the summit, also meant that our session on the circumpolar frontier carried considerably more weight than the agenda alone would have suggested. And it wasn't planned, it's just changed the room. And we've been very fortuitous. When we started the summit 3 years ago, we did not know how the world was going to change, but we knew the Indigenous people had a seat at the table if they don't own the table for investment in Canada, and it's just built from there.
Yeah, you can see over the 3 years, the interest in the summit tracks and mirrors the interest in Canada generally. So we're getting both Canadians more interested in coming to places like London and reaching out beyond North America for capital and partners, but also in places like London, you can see a growing interest and curiosity again in investing in Canada. Some of them are still want to see the proof in the pudding, but they are taking notice again of Canada and global events, and the profile of our Prime Minister has all helped and piqued their curiosity in Canada again. And you could see that in the attendance and the level of participation, the seniority of some of the people who are at the conference.
Yes, and we're speaking that very honored to have the Honorable Bill Blair, the new High Commissioner for Canada to the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, and he helped open the summit. And it was really great because he's just been in his post for a few weeks, and he's here to work because he was on point in terms of his conversation. That wasn't, here I am, isn't this wonderful, time to move on. He delivered, I thought, a very thoughtful speech.
Yeah, he's got a lot of experience too. Yeah, and his time in government as defense minister, he had a lot of contact and dealings with Indigenous people around Canada. And we weren't sure we were going to get him because he had only just been appointed. We couldn't plan much until the last couple of weeks, but he got right involved and made us one of his first priorities. So he hosted the nice dinner for speakers and sponsors the evening before the summit, and then he helped open the summit. And so, yeah, he was a great help.
Yes, and he stayed for, the sessions that followed, which again shows his commitment and interest, because they know the UK is a key market to help Canada achieve its objectives. So, the agenda gave people a structure, but what came out of the sessions was obviously far sharper than what the program could describe or imply for people. And the conversations between sessions was very powerful. So, Rob, we mentioned briefly circumpolar frontier, but we had mining, energy, infrastructure. Which of those should we dive into first to let some of our listeners who couldn't attend some of the key highlights?
Maybe the Silissums LNG project in northwest British Columbia, being led by the Nisga'a Nation.
Yes.
And we had Charles Morvan, who's the Secretary Treasurer of Nisga'a Nation. Sadly, President Eva Clayton had a health issue and wasn't able to travel and join us at the last minute. But Charles, who spent 20 years on council in different capacities, very knowledgeable and quite involved. So he was on the panel with Ernie Daniels, the CEO of First Nations Finance Authority. And so they discussed different financing options when it comes to these major projects. And the Silissums LNG is a major project that they're hoping will be close to making final investment decisions in the next few months.
Yes, and I think one of the key points of interest that came out is the separation the Indigenous communities have between delivering for their community and then doing business. And even if there's a chief sitting in two roles, their governance is best practice Years ago, they had the Roundtree Commission here to look at governance in the UK. And now you can see that same approach has been taken very, very diligently and professionally by the Indigenous peoples concerning that, which is important because if you're a partner or investor looking to work, you want to know, well, how's the other side going to be structured? And of course, people like the First Nations Major Project Coalition have spent a lot of time helping develop capabilities and capacities in the organization so they are ready to deal with third parties to move these significant projects along. And coming back to Ernie Daniels, said President and CEO of the FNFA, Ernie also sits as a board member for the Bank of Canada, which also shows how deeply embedded the Indigenous people now are in some of the most critical institutions, because that's really important. Because when the Bank of Canada is talking about setting rates, Ernie's able to give that input from what he sees and knows from his own work of what is going on with the Indigenous economy in Canada, which is, growing at 2 or 3 times the rate of the rest of the country.
Yeah, FNFA is growing like gangbusters. They just, before the summit, they did another bond financing, roughly $500 million. I think they raised, seem to have insatiable appetite. Investors, not just in Canada, but outside Canada. I know they had a number of meetings while they were in London with investors and potential investors of their bond issues. And I think one thing that stood out for me on that Cy Lissom's session was Charles Morvan talking about how Nisga'a, who are the 50-50, they're an equal partner in this joint venture, this major LNG project. It was the Nisga'a who pushed the government to support this particular project. And Charles talked about lobbying government
to get things
who were
done.
Hesitant. Yeah. And so
Wow.
I think our audience thought that they were going to be lobbying the government to slow down or stop a project, but this was lobbying the government to get a project moving. And they've been driving this project forward for a few years now.
And when do they hope to come on stream?
Well, if they make their final investment decision this summer, I think 2030, they're hoping something like that.
So not far away in the world we live in today. Can't come soon enough, right? More LNG. Asia's ready and waiting, looking for secure supplies. And that comes back to a West Coast pipeline. And just building on what you said about the Nisga'a Nation pushing government to get things done, we also heard a number of times where some chiefs had rejected investment or a proposal to do some development, and their community came back and gave the chief their marching orders to say, we want this done, go back and sign that deal. And that came up, a number of times. So that's a completely different reality to some historic perceptions people have that the Indigenous people of Canada don't want development. They absolutely want development. They know it's the only way for their communities to grow and prosper.
Yeah, and that's exactly one of the reasons we started this summit 3 years ago, was to change that perception and bring these energetic, articulate Indigenous leaders to London to talk about some of their really interesting projects and to dispel that myth that you just described.
Yes. So it's making progress in that area. And then we're very fortunate to have Daryl Murphy, Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure Debt at Aviva Investors, moderate one of our panels. And he was in conversation again with FNFA. And I think that was a strong conversation as well.
Yeah. When you've got somebody like, and another example of, or an indicator of the growing interest in Canada, the growing interest in our summit. Aviva have almost $500 billion under management. They are a major player We got them in the room, talked about, had a couple of the Maple 8 Canadian pension funds represented in the room. Some really big UK companies were there too. That's all an indicator of the growing interest.
Exactly. Without a doubt. And Professor and Alderman Michael Manelli, who's also president of the London Chamber of Commerce, had a fireside chat with Kitsaki with Chief Tammy Cook-Searson. And I thought that was a real fascinating conversation. And Chief Tammy, fortunately, had just been reelected. Can't recall exactly how many years, but it's 20 plus years now.
She's been on council 28 or 29, and she's been chief for more than 20. Eight elections she's won now. And that most recent one from just 2 weeks ago, she won by another landslide after more than 2 decades as chief. That's a very, very impressive record.
And she also sits on the board of Cameco. But coming back to Kitsaki, the Lac La Ronge Indian Band, they have assets of 108 or revenue of 180 million plus, right? So these are big groups. And coming back to that governance model, I mean, she was in a fight to be reelected as chief. It was a competitive ballot. But I think what it demonstrates again is there's different models for Indigenous nations, because you hear some cases where there's been a chief consistently in that position, and then you have other models where they change them every year. But what you get with the Indigenous peoples, it doesn't matter if it's the same chief or a different chief. When that community signs up, they have their plan because they're thinking 7 generations ahead in terms of how is this going to impact. So you never hear stories, oh, the chief changed and the whole game plan changed. When you have the Indigenous nation as a partner, on that side it's consistency. And remember last year, the CEO of Denison Mines was telling us his surprise that their deal was going to a vote with the community. And not many CEOs are used to, we're going to put that decision to the community for a vote. Doesn't happen in many companies, Rob. Mm-hmm. I haven't been in many where the CEO comes to the staff and says, hey, what do you think? But I think it comes back to when you're dealing with an Indigenous group, we all talk about the importance of culture and et cetera, et cetera. When you're dealing with an Indigenous group, they have a culture, right? And now they're some of the strongest business partners to work with. They don't have to shape the culture because they know what they're doing. So when you're competing with a non-Indigenous firm or working with a non-Indigenous firm, that firm might have culture issues, but you don't have to worry on the Indigenous side because they're committed. So I think that's a very positive outcome.
Yeah, that session I didn't get to see because I was in another session at the same time, but I know it had made an impression on a number of people, and that whole Kitsaki model and Chief Tammy's record. There was at least one other First Nation CEO of a DevCorp from another part of Canada who was there and said, I've got to get my chief and some others. We're going to go visit Lac La Ronge and talk to Ron Higgin, who's the CEO of Kitsaki, and Chief Tammy. We want to talk to them more and learn more about that model. And Canadians learning from Canadians at this summit is something we didn't really set out to do when we started. It was really about Indigenous people talking to British investors. But we have found over the years that the Canadians just talking to each other at the summit is one of the great benefits of this gathering.
Yes. And then when the UK and European investors are also in the room participating in those conversations, you really get your foot in the door early as you start to build those relationships. I'd really like to talk a little bit about the circumpolar frontier. We initially called that session the Arctic, which over here might have resonated, but the circumpolar frontier, when you talk about that in Canadian context, you're talking just about Nunavut. You're talking about the Northwest territories. You're talking about the Yukon as well as the northern part of the provinces. Saskatchewan and Manitoba, et cetera. And, we had that Arctic Security Corridor session.
Yeah, we had the CEOs, we had all the CEOs of the proponents of the two parts of that corridor, the Northwest Territory part. We had Paul Gruner, the CEO of Talicho Investment Corporation, and Mark Lewis, CEO of Dayton Joe Development Corporation. And we also had Brendan Bell of West Kitikmeot on the Nunavut side of that corridor and the Grays Bay Road and Port Project.
Just huge, because people is not, as we heard on one of our earlier podcasts, when Greenlanders come over to Nunavut, they think Canada's like 50 or 70 years behind, which is not something people think about when they think of Canada. They think, oh, it's progressive, it's ahead of the game. But the Arctic has been underinvested over the past number of years. And I think, they're just talking the ice roads, because that's the only way you can get to some of these places at the moment. They spend $25 million a year on an ice road since whenever. Just think of that money. If the decision had been made, we're going to build this thing way back when, how much money would have been saved and how much development would have taken place. So this comes back to not looking past, but that says the opportunity now, because the Arctic's melting. You've got Russia there, you've got China, you've got the Americans as interested as always. And when you look at Alaska, Greenland, and Canada, as well as Russia, we are way behind in Canada. So there's huge opportunities. And that's one of the projects. Just like the other part of the panel was discussing working with the submarines that Canada's set out to purchase, right? Right now we have one active submarine. We're a 3-ocean nation, the largest coastline in the world. At the end of World War II, we're the 4th largest Navy. And a bit of that was by default, but we also had that capacity. And now, just recently, the Prime Minister announced this huge investment in defense, $30 billion, I think, over 7 years it's going to flow through, which is huge opportunities. And the Indigenous people are focused on the defense sector. We had Sean Woolley from Desneti Group talking about what they've been doing because they saw this as a strategic sector. The government's committed at least 5% of procurement will be with Indigenous partners. And the Indigenous communities and EDCs have been out there buying and investing up businesses waiting for this moment, and they're ready to partner. And they're being chosen. We want to work with you because you've got a track record to get things done. I think that's part of the exciting things of these conversations taking place.
Yeah, and the numbers are staggering. Just before the summit, the government announced a $30 billion plus investment program in the North, Northern Defense and Infrastructure. And when you're talking about the North, you are working with Indigenous people. They are the largest, by far, part of the percentage of population. And for the non-Indigenous companies, if you want into those transactions, then you better be partnered or working in some way, in a meaningful way, with the Indigenous population.
Yes. And I want to also just come back to Ontario. We had for the second year support from the government of Ontario. And you and I have always want to make sure this is a commercial summit, not a platform. But we had Minister Rickford for the second year, who's Minister of Indigenous Affairs and responsible for the Ring of Fire in the province of Ontario. And the Ring of Fire is one of 3 critical mineral deposits in Canada. They were all represented, but Minister Rickford really came. He's obviously out there selling and promoting Ontario and Canada and doing a very good job of it.
That guy is everywhere. He is, tireless. Small communities, big gatherings across the country and all over the province. He is there championing Indigenous economic development. And in the Ring of Fire, after talk for many, many years about the lack of infrastructure, in the last several months, there's been real change with transmission lines and road proposals and things starting to move. And there could be shovels in the ground as soon as this summer on on some of those projects.
So that's just huge. But I think that sums up. I think we're going to run out of time here now, Rob. But I think it sums up some of those great conversations that took place and why people come to the summit. So if you attended the summit, you're very fortunate because you're going to get access. Everything was recorded, video and audio, and summaries of what took place, as well as the actual conversations for reflection and use in your own organizations to take things to a higher stage. But we've had very good feedback. It was a great couple of days. It was a great week, as a lot of the Canadians came over and had meetings around it. But what is your one takeaway for our listeners who the majority, of course, didn't attend? This is our podcast. You know, we've got thousands of listeners and they all can't make it.
I guess the biggest impression I was left with, Mark, was the growing interest in Canada and the growing interest in Indigenous projects by foreign investors and significant foreign investors and significant companies. They really are taking a second or another look at Canada, and across the board, attendees were really impressed, blown away by what they heard and some of the Indigenous leadership and Indigenous-led projects that were discussed at the summit.
Okay, well, that's helpful. And for you and I, the actual summit is that's the moment we get to meet everyone, engage with the attendees and have some wonderful conversations. But we both know now the work starts today for next year's summit. So we've had our moment. We got to meet with everyone, got a chance to go out to a pub, went to a football match, and now it's back to the grind. And you're heading back to Canada later today. So it's great to catch you before you hopped on a plane.
Well, my pleasure, Mark. It was a great week. And the work that you and the GigCMO team do, and the C1 and the rest of the team, just can't say enough. It is a year-round effort, and you are right. We're going to start today to plan for next year. I can't wait.
Yes. The triumvirate, you, me, and C1 driving this forward. So anyway, thanks, Rob. Have a safe flight back, and hope the weather's whatever you want it to be, whatever part of the country you're in. Okay?
Yeah,
see you soon.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye. For those of you who attended the summit, thank you once again for your support. And for those of us who are unable to attend the summit but are listening to the podcast today, we thank you for your continued support, and we hope you enjoy the insights that we've shared from the summit. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.